In April 1955, Albert Einstein was admitted to Princeton Hospital after suffering a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Doctors recommended surgery, but he declined, explaining that he did not want his life prolonged artificially and that, having completed the work he felt he was meant to do, he was ready to leave when his time came. A few days later, Einstein died. On the table beside his hospital bed were pages filled with handwritten notes, unfinished calculations, final ideas, and reflections connected to questions he had considered throughout his life. Death, consciousness, time, and what, if anything, might exist beyond physical life. Many of those thoughts had appeared not in formal scientific papers but in private correspondence and conversations with people he trusted, material never originally intended for a public audience. What makes these reflections so intriguing is that Einstein's view of death did not fit neatly into conventional religion, yet it also went beyond the simple materialist image many people associate with modern science. His position occupied a more complicated middle ground, and some of the ideas found there appear surprisingly similar to concepts later associated with Edgar Cayce and with accounts given by people who have survived near-death experiences. One passage in particular, written by Einstein in connection with death and loss, reveals a way of thinking about mortality that is rarely discussed and may permanently alter the way you understand what it means to die. To understand it, we first have to look beyond the simplified version of Einstein most people know. It is true that Einstein repeatedly stated that he did not believe in a personal God who watches every individual, listens to prayers, and intervenes directly in human destiny. Because of those statements, he is often described as an atheist. Yet that description leaves out an important part of his own position. Einstein also resisted being labeled an atheist and suggested that complete certainty about the non-existence of anything beyond measurable reality could be just as presumptuous as accepting a simplistic image of God without question. He rejected the picture of a human-like deity ruling the universe from above, but he continued to speak about something deeper than what science could fully explain. Depending on the context, he referred to this through expressions such as Spinoza's God, cosmic religious feeling, or simply the mystery underlying existence. It was especially in private letters, personal remarks, and less public reflections that Einstein expressed ideas about death that rarely appear in discussions of his physics. One of the most important of these ideas concerned the nature of time. Einstein was not merely interested in time as an abstract scientific variable. The implications of relativity also shaped the way he thought about human existence and death. According to the relativistic view of spacetime, the distinction we normally make between past, present, and future is not as absolute as everyday experience suggests. Events are not simply erased when the present moves forward. Instead, the structure of spacetime allows different moments to exist as parts of one greater whole. From that perspective, the past has not simply vanished, and the future is not merely an empty region waiting to be created. Past, present, and future can be understood as different locations within a single four-dimensional structure. If that interpretation is taken seriously, death begins to look very different. Rather than representing total disappearance, it may describe the point at which a person is no longer located within what we experience as the current moment. The individual does not necessarily become nothing. Instead, his or her existence belongs to another region of the same space-time structure. Einstein did not present this as a religious promise or a doctrine of the afterlife. He arrived at the idea through the implications of physics, which is precisely why it remains so provocative. In February 1950, a young rabbi named Robert Marcus, who had lost his son, wrote to Einstein. Einstein answered him, and within that reply he described the human being as a limited part of a much greater whole that we call the universe. We experience ourselves, our thoughts, and our emotions as if they were completely separate from everything else, but Einstein suggested that this sense of separation is a kind of illusion created by consciousness. He compared it to a prison that confines people to their own desires and to attachment toward only a small circle of those closest to them. The deeper task of human life, he suggested, is to move beyond this narrow sense of separation and expand compassion until it includes other living beings and the beauty of nature itself. This was not conventional religious consolation. It was a statement about what a human being fundamentally is. And if the individual is not an isolated entity that begins absolutely at birth and disappears absolutely at death, but instead exists as part of a greater whole, then death may be understood not as annihilation but as a change in the way that part relates to the whole. Another revealing document is Einstein's famous 1954 letter to the German philosopher Erich Gutkind, often called the God Letter, which was sold at Christie's in 2018 for more than $1.5 million. Einstein wrote it only a year before his death after reading Gutkind's work on religion. The letter became famous because of the unusual directness with which Einstein addressed God, Scripture, and organized religion. He described the conventional word God as a human expression and criticized the Bible as a collection of respected yet primitive stories. He also spoke critically of Judaism and other institutional religions, describing many of their beliefs as forms of inherited superstition. These are the lines most frequently cited by people who want to present Einstein as entirely hostile to religion. Yet they do not tell the whole story. Elsewhere, Einstein repeatedly acknowledged a profound feeling of reverence that had nothing to do with belief in a personal deity. When he contemplated the order of the cosmos, the extraordinary mathematical structure of nature, the consistency of physical laws, and the fact that the universe could be understood at all, he experienced a sense of awe that he regarded as genuinely religious in character. For Einstein, this feeling did not depend on religious institutions or theological doctrines. It arose from confronting the mystery behind observable reality and recognizing that the universe possesses an astonishing internal order. He did not believe in the biblical image of God in the ordinary sense, yet he clearly believed that reality contained a depth, structure, and mystery greater than human beings could completely grasp. Whatever name one chose to give that mystery, Einstein did not treat it as a comforting invention. For him, it emerged from the very structure of the universe he had spent his life studying. Perhaps the most direct expression of Einstein's attitude toward death appeared in a letter written after the death of Michele Besso, his closest friend for roughly half a century and a fellow physicist with whom he had exchanged ideas throughout much of his career. Besso died in March 1955, and Einstein himself would live for less than another month. In his message to Besso's family, Einstein wrote that his old friend had left this strange world only slightly ahead of him and that, from the standpoint of those who understood physics deeply, such a separation was not ultimately significant because the division between past, present, and future was an extraordinarily persistent illusion. Consider what that means. One of the most influential physicists in human history, a man whose work transformed our understanding of space and time, responded to the death of his closest friend not by appealing to heaven or religious doctrine but by turning to the physical nature of time itself. In that framework, death does not erase a person from reality. Besso was not simply reduced to nothingness, his life remained embedded within the same space-time structure in which it had always existed. He was no longer present at the particular temporal location occupied by those still alive, but that did not mean his existence had somehow been removed from the universe. If time is not literally a river carrying everything into non-existence but instead one dimension within a larger structure, then every moment occupies its own place within that structure. This is why Einstein's comments on death continue to fascinate people. He was not asking anyone to accept a spiritual teaching on faith. He was pointing toward consequences that arise from the way modern physics describes time. This leads to an even more unexpected comparison. Edgar Cayce, who had no formal education in theoretical physics and lived during roughly the same historical period as Einstein, repeatedly described consciousness and death in ways that appear strikingly similar at a conceptual level. In Cayce's readings, the soul was not confined to ordinary linear time. Past, present, and future were sometimes described as existing within a broader simultaneous reality, accessible from a perspective different from everyday physical consciousness. Death, in that view, was not the destruction of the person but a shift in perspective, a movement into another mode of experiencing a reality that had never ceased to exist. The dead did not disappear into absolute nothingness, they simply moved beyond the point from which the living could normally perceive them. Cayce expressed these ideas through mystical language, while Einstein approached the question through mathematics and physics. Their methods were completely different, yet certain descriptions appear remarkably close. A similar argument has been discussed in modern research on near-death experiences. Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel became widely known for research involving survivors of cardiac arrest, including a study published in The Lancet in 2001 involving 344 patients. In his later writings, Van Lommel explored the possibility that consciousness might not be produced entirely by the brain. Instead, he proposed that the brain could function more like an interface or receiver through which consciousness is expressed during physical life. Such a model is intended to address reports in which patients describe vivid, organized, and coherent experiences during periods of severe physiological crisis when normal brain function appears profoundly impaired. If consciousness is not completely generated by the brain, then the failure of the brain would not necessarily imply the total extinction of consciousness. Einstein himself did not formulate such a theory, and his work should not be treated as direct proof of Van Lommel's interpretation. Nevertheless, relativity, the spacetime model of the universe, and the broader physical principle that energy changes form rather than simply vanishing have often been used to create a conceptual framework in which questions about continuing consciousness can be explored. If consciousness were ever shown to possess properties not reducible to ordinary brain activity, then death might have to be reconsidered not as complete destruction but as some form of transition. That remains a philosophical and scientific question rather than an established conclusion, but it is precisely this possibility that makes the comparison so compelling. Einstein eventually refused surgery and accepted that his life was reaching its natural end. He died leaving behind a scientific legacy that changed civilization, but also a collection of personal reflections revealing a far more nuanced attitude toward mortality than the popular image of Einstein as a straightforward atheist would suggest. In his letters, in his understanding of time, and especially in his final words about Michele Besso, we find a view of death that is neither traditionally religious nor strictly materialistic. It points instead toward a third possibility, that existence may be larger than the narrow sequence of moments through which human consciousness normally experiences it. A physicist approached the possibility through equations, a mystic approached it through trance and spiritual experience, and people who have survived the boundary between life and death sometimes describe something that sounds surprisingly similar. Different languages, different methods, yet all seem to raise the same question. Perhaps death does not mean that a person has vanished from reality, but only that they now occupy a point we can no longer reach from where we are. Tell me in the comments, did anything you heard today change the way you think about death? And do Einstein's reflections carry a different kind of comfort precisely because they came not from a priest or a mystic, but from a physicist who spent his life trying to understand the deepest structure of reality?